Gospel music is a product of the religion, culture, and history that constitute the African American experience. Our fondest memories recount those simple, no-frill churches where we socialized, worshiped, ate pound cake, prayed, and prayed some more. We soon would see the proliferation of mega churches with stadium-type capacity, still having the basic things in common with those small, no-frill churches: gospel music and worship. The history of gospel takes its origins from various musical compositions: African melodies, slave songs, anthems, spirituals, and holy blues. The term gospel music would actually not be used formally until 1921. The term gospel is derived from the Anglo-Saxon phrase God spell, meaning good story. The church was then and is now a major source of refuge and strength. African Americans in the early church survived slavery and the Jim Crow South, only to be confronted with systemic racism, practices that still influence the daily African American existence. Their stories and their hope has always been captured in their music. They knew that God had and would continue to take care of them. This was one of those songs where you just had to sing along with them. Don't you remember? God will take care of you. Let's go back. During the era of slavery, music became a way to tell their stories and anesthetize the pain and dehumanizing condition of their lives. Field hollers would lead chants that would be repeated by others. These songs were called call and response songs. This music was possible because many of the slaves could not read or write, so call and response songs allowed people to participate in the songs while out in the fields. It has been historically noted that the song Wade in the Water's lyrics was a code song used by Harriet Tubman to educate slaves to select water routes when going north, so that the master's hound dogs would lose their scent. Isaac Watts was not impressed by the music sang in his church. He often complained. At one point, his father told him if he didn't like what was being sang, he should come up with something better. And he did. Approximately 600 hymns to his credit, his songs were challenging to the status quo as he ventured into writing songs about the human experience. This was a challenge to the traditional songs being sang at the time. The early 1700s would begin the period known as the Awakening, where strong religious influences would permeate the colonies. This period was characterized as a time when slaves were being encouraged to adopt Christianity. John Newton was originally a slave trader who converted to Christianity after a harrowing storm at sea that resulted in his conversion. He recounted the ship was sinking and he prayed to God to save him. By some miracle, the ship stopped sinking, and from that began his gradual conversion to Christ. While it took him over 30 years to completely renounce slavery, in 1772 he wrote the lyrics to Amazing Grace that would later be sang to the tune New Britain in 1835. Newton is quoted as saying, "I am not the man I ought to be, I'm not the man I wish to be, and I'm not the man I hope to be, but by the grace of God, I'm not the man I used to be." Amazing Grace is the most performed hymn and is reported to be performed at least 10 million times a year. Charles Wesley deserves mention as contributing to the foundations of gospel music. While he was one of the leading founders of the Methodist Church, he is credited with writing the lyrics for some 6,500 to 10,000 hymns. Some of his most notable hymns include Jesus, Lover of My Soul, and Christ the Lord is Risen Today. He is listed in the Gospel Music Hall of Fame because of his significant contribution to Christian lyrics. The first African Baptist church in Savannah, Georgia, under the leadership of Reverend George Leal, 1773, would see the establishment of a congregation who would become the first black church in North America. This was a harrowing feat in that slaves were not permitted to gather together for formal worship. While the congregation was clearly established, Reverend Leal would not be permitted to safely preach until 1775. Because Reverend Leal was loyal to the British, he received his freedom, but when they were defeated, he feared losing his freedom, so he left America, leaving the church in the hands of ordained minister Andrew Bryan. According to Eileen Southern, author of Hymnals for the Black Church, the first hymnal created for a black congregation was the collection of spiritual songs and hymns, published in 1801 by Richard Allen. Richard Allen is recognized as one of the founders of the African American Episcopal Church, or AME Church, the first independent African American church in the United States. Today, the African Methodist Church has over 6,000 churches and over 2 million members. In 1866, a year after the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, Fisk University would be the first United States school to allow freed slaves and students, irrespective of color, to attend. The Fisk University 9-member ensemble was formed in 1871 to tour and make money for the university. Their performance of spiritual music was a sound that would shock the nation because of the sophistication and sound that was a stark contrast to the minstrel music of that age. There were limited opportunities for African Americans to tell their own stories in song. They had to create these spaces for themselves, typically while working or during worship. In 1878, William Shakespeare, English playwright and poet, wrote the song "Keep in the Middle of the Road," a song that would become a favorite spiritual of black sharecroppers, but would historically be labeled as a product of the era of minstrel music. This music was in sharp contrast to the sophistication and style of the Fisk University Ensemble, who offered a counter to this type of music. Don't you turn to the right, don't you turn to the left, just keep it in the middle of the road. Now we move closer and closer to the age of gospel. During the 1920s and 1930s, the National Baptist Convention published the Gospel Pearls. In this book was 163 songs published as an official hymnal for the Baptist Church. Songs like Old Time Religion and Swing Low were featured in this gospel treasure. A quote from the book summed up the reason for creating the musical anthology. Born out of an urgent demand for real, inspiring, and adaptable music in all of our Sunday schools, churches, conventions, and other religious gatherings, it would be 50 years before this booklet would be replaced. Thomas Dorsey, known as the father of gospel music, began his career playing the blues. During the Great Migration, he left Atlanta for Chicago, and in 1924 premiered as Georgia Tom with blues great Ma Rainey, as it was his desire to play secular music. After suffering 2 nervous breakdowns, he made a commitment to give up playing blues and dedicate himself to the Lord. Mainstream churches rejected his style of music, which at the time referred to it as holy blues. In 1932, after losing his wife and child during childbirth, Dorsey recounted getting a strong song directly from God when he wrote the tune, "Take My Hand, Precious Lord." He would later team up with the great Mahalia Jackson in what would become known as the golden age of gospel music. During his lifetime, he would compose over 3,000 songs and was credited with creating the first gospel choir. Gospel would continue to flourish, with more gospel greats rising to the forefront. The Ward sisters from Philadelphia were thrust into the spotlight after appearing at the National Baptist Convention in 1943. They were theatrical and dramatic, at times raising eyebrows with their stage presence. By 1949, the Ward sisters would become the first black gospel artists to sell 1 million records. The Ward sisters' success would later be followed by other greats, including the Edwin Hawkins and the Edwin Hawkins Singers recording of "Oh Happy Day" in 1969, when it sold over 1 million copies in 2 weeks and eventually sold over 7 million copies worldwide. What is so brilliant about the song "Oh Happy Day" was that the lyrics were in the public domain at the time Edwin Hawkins recorded them. The song was actually an 18th century hymn, originally written by Philip Doddridge, based on Acts, the 8th chapter, 35th verse. The original title of the hymn was "Rejoicing in Our Covenant Engagement with God." James Cleveland, known as the King of Gospel, would become a 4-time Grammy winner, be the first gospel artist to earn a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and be inducted into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame. He died at the young age of 59. Charley Pride would also be recognized for his contributions to gospel music by earning 2 Grammys in 1971, when the Grammys were first televised. Shirley Caesar is also known as the First Lady of Gospel Music, earning over 12 Grammy Awards, receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award, and being inducted into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame. We would not do the discussion of gospel music any justice if we didn't mention Yolanda Adams, now referred to as the Queen of Contemporary Gospel. Not only does Yolanda have Grammy honors, she was also the first African American gospel artist to win an American Music Award. She too has been inducted into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame. Hi, I want to welcome everybody to another episode of Tabernacle Talks, and we have one of Tabernacle's own music extraordinaire, brother Edward James. Hey, EJ.
Hello, how are you?
Well, we're going to be talking about something that's near and dear to your heart, and that's gospel music. Before we even get into the questions, you always have questions. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself so they can see how grand you are.
I don't know about grand, but my name is Edward James. I am from Hampton, Virginia, born and raised. I lived there for most of my life, and then I moved here to Ohio to be the minister of music at Tabernacle Baptist Church. I come from an incredibly musical family on both sides. People parents, uncles, aunts, grandparents. My grandparents were in quartet groups. My mother sings, all of her sisters and brothers sing or play an instrument. They were music teachers. So everyone's musical. I've been playing the piano since I was 4. So recognizable things, my mom would say, since the age of
Okay.
so about 30, 33 years. A degree in music from Old Dominion University, and I've been able to put out some music myself, maybe 11 years ago. So I have some singles floating around on the internet and iTunes. But I'm a church baby. Right on
That's the
that
best
first.
kind of, but that's why you're an expert to talk about gospel music. And I'm excited that you agreed to do the interview today. So thank you so much for being so gracious.
Thank
I guess
you.
one of the first questions I have to ask you is, gospel music's changed over the years. As I've been studying, I've gone all the way back to the beginning, but what do you see as the biggest change in instrumentation and music? Just kind of walk us through what you see.
Instrumentation. Well, nowadays you tend to see more people in a band. Usually, you had an organ player or a piano player. A lot of times, especially in the early years, you saw a piano player, and then you started to get the Hammond B organ coming in, and then you'll probably have a lead guitar player, then you'll probably have a bass player, and then a drummer. And so now you're starting to see more guitars. So you'll probably get an acoustic player and another lead player, one that plays lead, one that plays rhythm. And then you'll have an organist and a piano player and a keyboard player. Sometimes you may have even another keyboard player. You'll have a horn section. For instance, Richard Smallwood has a whole orchestra that when his whole choir and band is together and he has the orchestra. And so nowadays you tend to get a lot grander of instrumentation instead of the pared down like it used to be back in the day. And that probably was due to the size of stage. I think maybe if they had more stage, they probably would have had more musicians. But sometimes I think nowadays you can see a stark difference with there just being a lot of people in the band in terms of instrumentation.
Now, you mentioned the name Richard Smallwood, and I'm familiar with that name, but there are other great gospel names. Can you share with us what some of the big names are in gospel music now?
Now you'll see J.J. Hairston, you'll see Todd Delaney, Jonathan Nelson and his brother Jason Nelson. They both have separate groups. You have Anthony Brown, Group Therapy, Ricky Dillard, still bringing it with the choirs. Kurt Franklin, of course, is always
Yes.
bringing out contemporary music. Tamala Mann, you're starting to see, and anybody who's used to Kurt Franklin and the Family, the original,
Yes.
that big, huge voice. So we've been familiar with Tamala Mann for 25, 30 years, and she has her solo career. You have Travis Green, then you have Corinne Hawthorne,
Wow.
who got her fame on The Voice, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, she was probably one of the first contestants on that show to start singing gospel music.
Wow.
If I remember correctly. And she got signed to, I forgot, My Block, which is a label out in LA from one of the Marys, Erica Campbell's husband, Warren Campbell, and they're doing some powerful things out there as well. So there are Kiara Sheard of the Clark Sisters dynasty. Of course, the Clark Sisters are still strong. The legends are still around. So yeah, there's still some big names in gospel music now.
Well, I would hope people that are watching the show, when they hear all those names, they write some of them down and go back
They
and check out
do.
some of those artists, because there's so
Yeah.
many that, you just need to check them out. So I'm hoping everybody out there that heard all those names will check them out. Do you think that those artists are staying true to gospel music, or do you think that they're testing the boundaries and coming up with their own sounds?
That's a unique question, because as a musician, you're always testing the boundaries. You're always pushing to see, not necessarily how far you can take things, but usually creative minds are always listening to everything. Because there are plenty of gospel music artists who have Prince as their inspiration, who have Michael Jackson as their inspiration, Janet Jackson as their inspiration, Sting, Chicago, the Rolling Stones. And so as a musician, you just kind of, you hear a catchy rhythmic pattern, or you'll hear a horn riff, or you'll hear a guitar chord structure, and it kind of sticks in your brain. And so when you're writing your own music, you start to kind of pull little things that you hear everywhere. So I think they're always testing the boundaries. I know when Kirk Franklin first came out, it was kind of a shock, because I know when we started singing Kirk Franklin back in, I say, what, the mid 90s, early 90s, a lot of people were like, oh, okay, this is not what we're used to. And then you had Diedrich Haddon. I remember he came out in the early late 90s, and it had a bit of a groove to it. You started getting John P. Key, who started adding a little bit of James Brown here and there. And a lot of church people, at least in my church, were a little taken aback. Okay, wait a
You're
minute.
like, what is that?
Yeah, so I remember Ricky Dillard, one of his earlier recordings of a song from James Hall called God Is in Control. And there was a breakdown at the end of the song when all of the different sides of the choir, soprano, they're singing their different parts, and the band has stopped and everybody's clapping, and then the band comes in and they play a line from Do You Remember the Time, Michael Jackson. And I remember the very first time we played that breakdown, and you could see the church people say, wait a minute, I recognize that. Oh, wait, that's Michael Jackson. Wait, why are you playing Michael Jackson? So I think testing the boundary, you're always kind of testing that boundary to see sometimes what you can get away with, but not in a defiant way, but more in a let's see how it would go if we had an acoustic guitar do How Great Thou Art, and we sing it in more of a like pared down sit style instead of with a traditional organ. So you kind of get.
When you think of those new age artists, and I think they're new age artists because I think they are testing the boundaries, and the music is just so moving. It's moving with, I think, all of the orchestration that they have. How do you think it differs from the Mahalia Jacksons or the Ward sisters?
How does it differ? Well, I would say it was a lot less accessible then. I was born in '84, so I can't really say what was done in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but I'm pretty sure Clara Ward was not a staple on your television. Or when Mahalia Jackson sang, when Mahalia Jackson sang and you saw her on television, you weren't seeing her every day. So when she stood there and sang, and sometimes that the sweat would be rolling down and her hair would get mussed up, and you can just feel it, and you can tell that she feels it, and you can kind of feel that anointing that she has, and you could tell she didn't care who she was singing in front of. She was just delivering the gospel. But it was, I won't say more heartfelt, but it was more poignant because, again, you probably saw her maybe once or twice a year on your television screen. You may have had the record, but actually seeing the performance, you probably saw her only one time. And so it kind of sticks in your brain when you see her, especially a Black woman on television, singing the gospel in front of white people. It kind of sticks in your brain. And nowadays, we kind of take for granted because, I mean, you can go on any app, any YouTube channel, Instagram, and you can kind of hear any artist, really. You don't even really have to pick up their album. You can really hear any artist on any platform now. So it kind of, unless you have a personal connection with the song, it kind of loses the specialness of that once in a lifetime seeing Mahalia Jackson or Marian Anderson sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Like that, back then, you did not see stuff like that. A sea of Black people and seeing Marian Anderson singing at in Washington, D.C., you just didn't see things like that. But nowadays,
it was iconic. It was iconic.
Iconic, yeah. Nowadays, you really don't get iconic nowadays.
You can YouTube them.
Yeah, you can YouTube them now. But I think it sticks in your brain more, again, because you rarely saw that kind of act on television, much less a gospel group. And you know, the Clara Ward, the Ward singers, I mean, they were dancing all around the stage. I mean, they were electric. And again, when you saw that on your television screen, again, in the context of a lot of times it was a white audience.
Yes,
it
absolutely
made
right.
it a lot more special because you saw yourself, and we really didn't ever really get a chance to see ourselves. We could hear ourselves. You know, a lot of people had records, but actually seeing it live, I think back then gave just a touch of iconic, a touch of specialness to it.
Now you've recorded, and you know, technology certainly allows a musician to create thematic music that you probably wouldn't have been able to do in the earlier days. And so I think you've got a lot of latitude in how that music is being delivered to the public. What trends do you think we're going to continue to see in terms of music, you know, instrumentation, how music's delivered? And I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that.
I think we're going to see more virtual worship sessions, pared down, just a camera, and going live and just worshiping. I think this pandemic has kind of sparked, and I think people were, well, not think, I know people were doing it before, but I think now it's very intentional to be able to reach people online. And we're kind of seeing the impact of, especially at Tabernacle. I mean, we've been able to reach over 500,000 people, and
Yes.
it's still been less than a year. So having that kind of weight and knowing that you can reach that many people just by simply posting something on Facebook or YouTube, I think a lot of people are saying, well, you know, I can debut my music on a YouTube channel, or I can just sit here with my guitar and just worship, and whoever just comes on with me can just worship with me. But I also I'm seeing a revival of choir music, because there's this space maybe in the last 15, 20 years where you were starting to see groups shrink. I mean, you still have the Chicago Mass, you still have Mississippi Mass, you still have the Georgia Mass Choir, mega choirs, but you were starting to see smaller ensembles where you have maybe 20 singers or 12 or 10. You were getting a lot of solo singers that had maybe 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 singers behind them. But now you're starting to see a revival of people wanting that choir sound again, that big, huge choir foot stomping sound with the robe. You're starting to see a lot of groups come back to wearing the choir robes. So I think there is kind of doing two things. It's kind of bouncing backwards and then bouncing forwards, just kind of maybe depending on where you fit on your gospel music spectrum.
Well, Minister EJ, I knew you were a wealth of knowledge before I asked you to come on the show, and you have more than demonstrated that you know music and you know gospel music. And I just want to thank you. I'm going to give you the last word. Anything you want to share?
Just know that the one through line in gospel music is the word of God. And it is basically teaching people about Jesus through song. And so no matter what artist you listen to, if you still listen to Andre Crouch or Mahalia Jackson, or if you go and listen to some of our newest artists, for instance, here in the Ohio area, Chris Betts, if you, whatever you listen to, just remember that the through line of it all is teaching people about Jesus Christ. And however you do it, God requires you to do it with a spirit of excellence. So no matter what your style is, anybody who's watching this who have written a song, or you're scared to sing, or you're scared to put yourself out there, or you're scared that, well, maybe it's too traditional, or maybe it's too contemporary, just if that's the song that God has given you in your heart and you feel led by the Holy Spirit, then do what God tells you to do. Worship. Come online. We have so much access now. Go on Facebook Live and just worship the Lord. And that's all really it boils down to. We're all just called and made, literally made to worship Christ. So that would probably be the thing that I would say. Just any genre that you listen to, the main thing is, what are you learning about Jesus Christ, and how is that artist helping you with your lifestyle? Because worship is a lifestyle. It's not necessarily a song. Worship is an everyday, consistent thing. When you wake up in the morning, when you go to bed at night, it's how you live your life. And if you can do it with a song, then you have a little bit of pep in your step.
In 2019, the following songs were named the top 5 songs of the decade: Every Praise, Won't He Do It, You Deserve It, Take Me to the King, and Wanna Be Happy. Now introducing Mahalia Jackson, the most influential gospel artist of our lifetime.
Jesus, Lord, if you please. You know, I'm daily walking, Lord, close with thee. Oh, let it be, dear Lord, Lord, let it be. Oh, Lordy, I am weak, but thou art strong. Oh, yes. And Jesus, keep me, Lordy, from all wrong. And I'll be satisfied as long, oh, yes, as I can walk. Just let me walk, Lordy, close with thee. Every day I say just a closer walk with thee. Oh, yeah. You know, granted, Jesus, Lord,